The Minnesota Starvation Experiment, how 32 men volunteered to starve, and what their suffering taught science about hunger, the mind, and the resilience of the human body. The Road Ahead, 0105. Why Starve Volunteers in 1944. The Mind Unravels, Hunger's Psychological Toll. 06. The Architect, Dr. Ansel Keys, The Refeeding Paradox. 07. Inside the Year-Long Protocol, Starvation Syndrome and Eating Disorders Today. 0408. The Body Under Siege, Metabolic Collapse, Ethics, Legacy, and What We Owe. Let me set the stage. Picture it, 1944. The Allies are pushing through liberating camps and cities, and they keep encountering the same horrific problem, starving populations. But here's the terrifying dilemma no one was prepared for. You can't just hand a starving person a loaf of bread. Refeed too aggressively, and you trigger what we now call refeeding syndrome, a cascade of metabolic chaos that can be fatal within days. The U.S. government realized they had zero scientific data on how to safely renourish large populations. That is the urgent life or death question that launched this experiment, and that's why what happened next matters so deeply. The man who led this extraordinary effort was Dr. Ansel Keys, and if that name rings a bell, it should. Keys was already a scientific heavyweight. He developed the K-ration for soldiers and conducted groundbreaking high-altitude physiology research. But Keys wasn't content with laboratory abstractions. He believed that when the world had an urgent, life-threatening problem, scientists had a duty to confront it directly. So he designed something unprecedented, a controlled, year-long study that would push human volunteers to the very edge of starvation and then bring them back. The audacity of that design still takes your breath away. Now, who would sign up for this? 32 conscientious objectors, men who had refused to carry weapons on moral grounds but were desperate to serve their country in a meaningful way. Think about that kind of courage for a moment. They weren't soldiers trained for hardship. They were teachers, students, pacifists, and they agreed to walk into a laboratory knowing full well that for the next year their bodies and minds would be pushed to the breaking point. Their names deserve to be remembered. Men like Gerald Wilsnack, Marshall Sutton, and Jasper Garner, whose photographs capture moments of strange normalcy between the grueling daily routines of the experiment. Let's walk through the architecture of this experiment, because the design was as meticulous as it was brutal. Phase 1, 12 weeks of generous feeding at 3,200 calories a day, establishing exactly what normal looked like for each man, their weight, their metabolic rate, their psychological profile. Then came the harrowing, Phase 2, 24 weeks of semi-starvation, about 1,570 calories daily, mostly potatoes, root vegetables, dark bread, and macaroni. The goal was chillingly precise. Each man had to lose a quarter of his starting body weight. After 6 months of hunger, Phase 3 began, restricted rehabilitation, where Keys divided the men into groups receiving different calorie levels to systematically test which refeeding approach worked best. Only in the final 8 weeks were the men allowed to eat without restriction. Now, let's look at what happened to their bodies during those long months of deprivation. 6. The physical toll. Here's where the data gets sobering. The men's resting energy expenditure dropped by 266 kilocalories per day, but that's just the headline. Look deeper, insulin levels plummeted by 54%. The body was essentially shutting down its metabolic machinery. Leptin, the hormone that regulates hunger and energy balance, fell by 44%. And T3, the active thyroid hormone that controls metabolic rate, down 39%. This isn't just eating less. This is the body in full-scale emergency mode, systematically dismantling its own energy infrastructure to survive. Every one of these numbers represents a physiological system under siege. But here's something even more disturbing. The body doesn't lose weight evenly. Look at this chart. Skeletal muscle, down 5%. That might sound modest, but the liver, the body's metabolic command center, shrank by an astonishing 13%. Kidneys lost 8% of their mass. The body was literally consuming its own vital organs to keep the brain alive. And notice, this selective organ wasting means that even when someone looks recovered after refeeding, their internal organ function may still be profoundly compromised. This finding alone reshaped how we think about nutritional rehabilitation. No. 9. The mind unravels. Now let's talk about the part of this study that genuinely haunts people, the psychological transformation. On the left, you see the behavioral changes. Men who had been active, social, intellectually curious, became obsessed with food. They collected recipes. They stared at cookbooks for hours. They chewed gum incessantly. One man went through 40 packs a day. On the right, the emotional toll was even darker. MMPI personality tests showed massive spikes in depression and anxiety scales. The men became snappish, withdrawn, suspicious of each other. And then there's the incident that still chills researchers today. One participant, in a state of psychological distress, deliberately amputated 3 of his own fingers with an axe, and afterward told doctors he couldn't explain why he'd done it. That moment crystallized something terrifying. Starvation doesn't just affect your body. It can dismantle your very sense of self. Here's the cruelest twist in this entire story. And this is something every clinician who treats eating disorders understands intimately today. When the men finally started getting food again, you'd expect relief, joy, a sense of returning to normal. Instead, the first 6 weeks of rehabilitation were, for many, the most psychologically agonizing phase of the entire experiment. Depression deepened, anxiety spiked, irritability intensified. The researchers were stunned. They had assumed that feeding would fix the mind as well as the body. But the data showed something far more complex. The psychological damage of starvation has its own timeline, its own inertia, and it doesn't simply reverse when the calories return. This finding alone has enormous implications for how we treat eating disorders today, and we'll get to that. I want to pause here and let the lived experience of these men speak. The 2-volume masterwork that came out of this experiment, The Biology of Human Starvation, published in 1950, runs over 1,300 pages. But buried within all that data are the voices of the participants themselves, describing what starvation actually felt like from the inside. It wasn't just hunger pangs. It was a total cognitive hijacking. The inability to think about anything except food, the erosion of personality, the loss of who you thought you were. These descriptions shocked the research community in 1950, and they still have the power to shock us today. So why does a study from 1944 still matter in 2026? Because it fundamentally changed how we understand eating disorders. Before the Minnesota experiment, clinicians assumed that the psychological symptoms of anorexia, the food obsession, the depression, the social withdrawal, were causes of the disorder. But the experiment demonstrated something revolutionary. You can take 32 psychologically healthy young men, starve them, and they will develop those exact same symptoms. That flipped the entire treatment model on its head. It meant that many of the mental symptoms of eating disorders are actually physiological consequences of malnutrition. The clinical implication is profound. Refeed the brain, and many of those symptoms begin to lift. This insight saves lives every single day in eating disorder treatment centers around the world. We can't leave this story without confronting its ethical shadow. The Minnesota experiment predates modern research ethics. There were no institutional review boards in 1944, no formal informed consent protocols as we understand them today. The Nuremberg Code, which established the principle of voluntary consent in human experimentation, wouldn't be drafted until 1947, 2 years after this study ended. Some of these men sustained lasting psychological damage. The participant who amputated his own fingers, that's real, irreversible harm. And yet, the knowledge gained from their suffering has guided the treatment of millions. So I'll leave you with this question, not because it has an easy answer, but because it's one every scientist and every citizen should sit with. When does the potential to relieve future suffering justify causing suffering in the present? Let me close with the scale of this legacy. The final report, The Biology of Human Starvation, ran 1,385 pages across 2 volumes. It remains, to this day, the most comprehensive study of human starvation ever conducted. 32 men gave a year of their lives. 80-plus years later, their data still shapes how we treat malnutrition, how we understand eating disorders, and how we think about the profound connection between body and mind. Millions of patients, famine victims, eating disorder sufferers, post-surgical patients, have benefited from what those 32 men endured. That is a monumental legacy. So, here's where we land. The Minnesota Starvation Experiment teaches us that hunger is never just about food. It is a total body, total mind crisis, physical, psychological, social, and existential, and those dimensions cannot be pried apart. It teaches us that recovery is not the moment you start eating again. It's a long, arduous climb that can feel worse before it feels better. And it teaches us that the foundations of modern eating disorder treatment, the principle that you renourish the body to heal the mind, were built brick by painful brick by 32 volunteers in a Minneapolis laboratory 8 decades ago. Their sacrifice compels us to keep asking hard questions about the science of hunger, about the ethics of how we gain knowledge, and about our shared responsibility to those who suffer. Thank you.